It is always said that we have talked about the importance of nutrition in any treatment. We all say it. Everyone says it. But then when it comes to implementing a diet, many times we don't know where to start. When we give a patient dietary recommendations, like a paper saying, well, remove this, add that, I don't know the percentage, but I can tell you that if you don't explain it well, if you don't support them in changing their habits, maybe 60% of the patients won't do it. They won't carry it out because it's very complex, because it doesn't fit into their life, their environment, or what they like. So it is important that we take a moment to explain the diet and adapt it to the patient. I know that sometimes, many of you here are doctors, others are not, but I understand that you treat people, or you are here because you want to treat people, and sometimes you don't have the time to dedicate an entire consultation to developing a diet, to creating a nutritional history, and so on. So I am going to tell you how to do this. We are going to talk about it, and also some tips to make it simple, because sometimes we don't need to spend an hour with the patient discussing what they eat, but we can give them a questionnaire, or we can ask certain questions. I am also going to talk about coaching, about how we can motivate them to make that change, because it is of no use to provide a diet that we know is wonderful if they do not follow it. Sometimes we need to start with small changes, and those are the ones that will be most effective. I am fortunate to work with a multidisciplinary team. I focus on diet and see patients every month, sometimes patients with cancer every 15 days, and I talk about diet all day long. Then I have another team of doctors, 4 internists who work with me, along with nurses and others who will provide supplements and carry out other treatments. And I have the luck to dedicate myself solely to this. So that's why patients follow that diet, but I have to provide them with recipes, ideas, and I have to do many things that often aren't done. So let's talk about this, about what dietary practices are. I was listening to the 2 talks yesterday, both of which were great, and they discussed food and macronutrients. I am not going to dwell on that. But it is true that there are some things that will be repeated. I will try to keep them to a minimum. However, after listening to Isabel yesterday, I loved everything she said, and we are completely in agreement with what we think. So I will repeat some concepts and briefly touch on them. In the end, we are talking about nutrition, and it is inevitable that some things will be repeated. How is the talk going to go? Well, at the beginning, I will talk about how I will put into context what nutrition is. Then I will discuss how to create a good nutritional history, what is important, how we can even weigh a patient, conduct an anthropometric study, and what we need to ask them to really know what they eat. Then I will talk about the different diets, or what factors will influence our choice of one nutritional pattern over another. In the clinical cases, you will see that sometimes 2009, I am the first one who has several diets I can implement, and I have to rely a bit on intuition. I remove foods that contain histamine. I create a diet for candidiasis. I take away a higher protein diet because he needs to lose weight. And if I start with everything, then he won't eat anything. So we need to know how to choose the right diet, the nutritional pattern, which I prefer to call it that way. And then in the last hour, we are going to talk about coaching, which has also seemed interesting in the course. I use it a lot in consultations. In the end, it is simply communication techniques, how we can convey the change to the patients. We are really talking about something difficult for them, and we have to motivate them, because changing habits is not easy, and it is also something more enjoyable. I think that for the last hour it is fine, and I hope it also brings something positive for your consultation. Well, let's get started. Well, yesterday we also talked about the difference between eating and nourishing oneself. This is a very basic concept, and many of the things I'm going to tell you, you may already know. Nowadays we all know a lot about nutrition, but it is important to have the concepts clear. Well, eating or nourishing oneself is everything that happens from the moment I choose the food until the food reaches my mouth, and that is where we will act with dietetics. Dietetics is the creation of diets or nutritional patterns that will help ensure optimal nutrition later on. Nutrition is everything that happens from my mouth until the nutrients reach my cells. You will talk a lot about this throughout the course, because you will discuss micronutrition, supplementation, and metabolic pathways. But we will not cover that today. Today, we are going to talk about what dietetics is and how to create a good nutrition plan. The act of eating is voluntary, and the choice of foods is influenced by many factors, things we need to know about the patient or even about ourselves. Sometimes we are not aware of why we are eating one way or another. We need to be aware of this and understand how the patient is eating, as well as the reasons and purposes behind it, in order to truly help them. And it has many social and cultural connotations that we will now see and that we must not forget. I now said that in order to learn more about nutrition and to be able to help my patients and myself more, I studied macrobiotics and Ayurveda. But well, in the end, you logically understand that what is most familiar to us, the patterns we have followed our whole lives, are the ones we feel most comfortable with. And you also have to work on that, on a Mediterranean diet that is simple and accessible for everyone. But the other is a contribution that is also interesting. Yesterday, they talked about Chinese medicine, about yin yang, and the energetic value of foods. I have studied it, but it is true that these are concepts that are sometimes difficult for the patient to understand, and for me as well. With my mindset as a nutritionist who studies a lot of biochemistry, it ultimately becomes difficult to understand, but they are indeed things that can help in the treatment of diseases and when it comes to properly guiding a patient, because many times you feel lost. You give a diet that you think is the best, but then you realize that there is another one that is better, and it depends on all these things. So what is dietetics? Dietetics is the discipline that studies dietary regimes, their nutritional implications, and diet, which comes from the word diet, is everything we eat and drink in a 24-hour period in a day. It is a way of life. The word diet, which is why I always say that I don't like to talk about diet, has many negative connotations, because when we think of diet, we think of restriction, of stopping eating, of going hungry. Because we have always talked about diet for hypocaloric regimens and for weight loss, we haven't concerned ourselves much beyond that. Now there is a social change happening, and people are becoming more concerned about eating well to be healthier and feel better. They are talking about this more and more on television and in the media, but until recently that wasn't the case. When I say that I am a dietitian, nutritionist, people think that what I do is help people lose weight. And in my practice, I see people with obesity and weight loss. I also spent 3 years at the bariatric surgery clinic, where everything I saw was obesity. But nowadays, I see little weight loss. Many people come to my practice to learn how to eat because they have illnesses, as I mentioned, and all the patients being treated in an integrative medicine team need to have proper habits. One, diet then is simply this. It is what we are going to eat, and it will help us to be well-nourished and well-fed. And when we talk about integrative dietetics, we are going to go a little further because, as I mentioned, we will try not only to consider what is optimal for the patient nutritionally, which of course is important, but we will also try to understand their social context, their psychological and social connotations, everything that will influence their eating habits so that the change is successful and people can eat in a way that is also satisfying and feel good about the change. We are going to take into account the wholeness of the person, which is also what integrative medicine is about, considering all nutritional aspects, psychological aspects, and social aspects, and we will personalize a lot. Today we are going to talk about nutrigenetics, chronobiology, and how many factors influence a patient's life. I need to adapt the diet accordingly. For example, I have to know how to guide a person who works shifts, as they need to eat at certain times, and how they will adjust their meals to this rhythm, which is completely misaligned with the chrono disruption they experience. I need to understand this. And that will logically be different for another person. It is necessary to always adapt. Although ideally, one would say, well, don't work with Saturn because it is bad for your health. If that is not possible, then how can I adapt the diet to make it as suitable as possible so that one feels their best? Well, to put it in context, if I want to say, hey, I want to learn more about nutrition, besides the basics that were given yesterday, which are fundamental, I need to know what a protein is, what a carbohydrate is, what a fat is. I have to start from there, what micronutrients are. That is basic. But in the end, to know how nutrition will affect the prevention of diseases, the easiest way is through epidemiological studies. Studies in nutrition are very complex. Yesterday we saw this with the discussion about fats yes, fats no. Well, nowadays in nutrition, there are studies that can practically demonstrate everything, all diets. The Paleolithic diet is well established and has many studies showing how beneficial it is for us to eat like the Paleolithic man. Well, for some people who will have a certain genetic burden, for others it won't. In practice, that often doesn't work. The vegetarian diet is wonderful and is the one that most prevents diseases. I don't know if you have read the China study, which is a very interesting book on nutritional epidemiology. I didn't include it in what I recommended for you to read, but it is definitely worth reading. In the end, we come to the conclusion that one must be completely vegetarian. Well, no. There are people who become completely vegetarian. but their bodies do not respond well because we are omnivores and need some protein. There are other people who are the opposite. I have patients, I listen to them. I am vegetarian, I am vegan because I believe in it. And it works well for me. I balance it out, and we will continue with your vegetarian diet. I recently had an athlete, a marathon runner, who followed the Stapelian diet, which excludes all cereals. As a nutritionist, I thought, where does this man get his carbohydrates from? Yet he was doing so well and had been following this type of diet for many years. Then I will talk to you about different diets that in the end I had to guide him a bit on that path, simply to balance him out, but I cannot completely change his nutritional pattern. The Eskimos do not eat the same as what people eat in Okinawa or in the Himalayas. They eat the same thing. And yet all the patterns have often been shown to help prevent certain diseases because they are complete lifestyle patterns. It's not just about what they eat. There are many more factors. But that's why I want us to open our minds a bit and see that there are many patterns that can be optimal. If what we eat is of good quality, we return to quality, to eating organic products. When they say the paleo diet consists of eating a lot of meat and vegetables because that is what Paleolithic humans ate, I don't eat grains because they couldn't cultivate them and we are not adapted to farming. But you run after the animal like they did in the Paleolithic, but you eat organic meat like they ate in the Paleolithic. It is good to understand it, it is good to study it because it slightly changes our view of what an adequate diet is. But sometimes proteins are not that bad. However, it is true that everything needs to be put in context. Nutritional epidemiology studies these patterns in the prevalence of diseases. It is a very young discipline, really, due to the difficulty of measuring diet as a factor of exposure and the complexity of diet. It resides in the exposure to nutrients. The exposure to nutrients is continuous and very complex. If we ask any of you whether you think about what you eat, you would say that you don't eat the same thing every day and that it changes from one month to another. So it is difficult to see what dietary pattern each person has. And in practice, it is also necessary to understand it in order to adapt nutrition to individual susceptibility. I am going to talk to you about some interesting facts in nutritional epidemiology. For example, the blue zones. I really like this study because it simply talks about certain areas of the world where there is a lower prevalence of diseases, where the people living there are more centenarians, which is closely associated with their way of eating. The blue zones are said to be Sardinia in Italy, the island of Okinawa, which I believe almost everyone knows for its low prevalence of cancer, as the people there are very centenarian. In California, the Seventh-day Adventists, and in the Nicoya Peninsula, which have been identified as the 4 areas in the world with the highest number of centenarians, and also good health, because we can be centenarians, but with a lot of comorbidities and polypharmacy. Here, it is not seen that they have good health. Therefore, it is always associated with a more vegetarian diet. Okay, that is true, and that is the way it is. But we also see that they lead a certain lifestyle, that they have a calm lifestyle, and that they exercise regularly. We spend 8 hours sitting every day, as we have to go to the gym for 1 hour, but if you exercise consistently every day because you are moving, you don't know what it's like to go do 1 hour of sports, but you don't stop sitting. So that also has an impact. Living a relaxed life, free from stress and noise, influences everything. There are also other theories that I have mentioned above, such as the hypothesis that it has been observed that in certain areas, people living at higher altitudes, for example in Sardinia, particularly in mountainous regions, are where the most centenarians live. Well, the geographical location where we are can also have an influence. It's not just about diet. Then there will be those who say, well, it is proven that in this place, if they eat this, they have a lower prevalence of diseases. And then there will be someone who tells you, no, it's because they live in the mountains. And that's why, well, everything is multifactorial, and we are not going to know. What is clear to us and what clinical experience tells me after seeing many patients is that if we eat well, we will indeed be healthier. The PREDIM study is a study currently being conducted in Spain. It is the largest epidemiological study ever done in Spain. And it is examining how nutrition, particularly the Mediterranean diet, helps us prevent diseases, especially cardiovascular ones. They are conducting this study with a lot of people, specifically 7,447 individuals over many years. They have been studying for about 5 or 6 years, and the study continues to show how it is helping to prevent cardiovascular diseases. However, they are drawing other conclusions and have many publications. I'm sharing this because it's good for us to sometimes see these things, and the study is really about how they took 3 groups of the population and supplemented their diets. They provided isocaloric diets, meaning with the same amounts of calories and very similar, with olive oil for some, walnuts for others, and nothing for the last group. It seems very simple, but in the end, we are seeing how the intake of polyunsaturated fats, which we talked about yesterday regarding the importance of fats, is indeed good and extremely important. You can see here how incorporating fats is being studied as a preventive factor and something positive that can help us. And so, well, these are studies that it's good for us to read and see what conclusions they will draw. Well, they are drawing many conclusions, but it is also true that they might suddenly say, hey, not many conclusions can be drawn from this study. Why? Because they are trying to study how olive oil affects walnuts in a nutritional pattern that they do not know. A 6-year-old can experience a lot of stress and may lead a very sedentary life. This is not being addressed. And it could be that sometimes this is why the studies are not conclusive. So that also needs to be taken into account in the end, which is why clinical experience is so important. And here I present a nutritional pyramid, which has always been the way to define diets or nutritional patterns that are appropriate. And we see that the pyramid is already changing. Fortunately, because before, at the base, there were only cereals. The ones we all practically know, 50% of our diet had to be cereals. And we know that's not true. That pyramid was created in the US by the Department of Agriculture, and they placed all the cereals at the base. We know that there are many economic interests involved in all of this. We don't need so many cereals or so many carbohydrates. Now, at the foundation, they have established a healthy lifestyle incorporating many vegetables. There is indeed a trend towards adopting more vegetarian diets, not completely vegetarian, but with a foundation of fruits, vegetables, legumes, cereals, and nuts. Because in the end, it is a much more antioxidant diet and less pro-inflammatory. But then we will see that there are patients who do have a significant dysbiosis, and the consumption of cereals is sometimes not so good. So what cereals should I eat? But if we talk about diet for a healthy person, a diet for prevention, then one should always consume significantly more grains than animal proteins. And I have included in the things you had to read or watch that we proposed a video of Dr. Campillo that I really like, which talks about Darwinian medicine. And he has also written a book called El Monobeso. I don't know if anyone here has read it, El Monobeso. Have you read it? Yes, some do. Well, I thought the video would be a shorter way to avoid making you read an entire book, which is great for you to read, to see what it talks about, how we have evolved, and how eating in one way or another has helped us become who we are. Yesterday, they talked about it, about the importance of fats. Starting to eat carrion, starting to eat more fats made our brain develop, because our brain is practically all fat and our brain has a lot of omega-3. So in the end, why is fat important? At one point in history, it helped us evolve, and today we need it. It talks, for example, about how at a moment in evolution, our very distant ancestors, the Australopithecus, which is prior to the genus Homo, lost the ability to produce vitamin C endogenously while almost all animals produce it. So there we also understand why we need many antioxidants, because we do not have that large production of antioxidants as great as most animals. So understanding all of this is also beneficial because in the end it is associated, for example, with studies on how diabetes and metabolic syndrome are linked to lower amounts of vitamin C and antioxidants in the body. So we have to eat them because we do not produce them. We produce them but not in large quantities. And we also live in an environment that greatly favors oxidative stress. Therefore, it is important. It also talks about the thrifty genotype, which I wanted you to see because we will briefly discuss nutrigenetics later, and I will present a case of obesity and metabolic syndrome, focusing on the genes that are studied, 2009, and understanding where those genes come from. Insulin resistance at one point in evolution was something positive for us. Why? Because, as I said, we come from species that lived in the jungle. The Australopithecus, which is the predecessor to the name, is complicated to remember. Being prior to the genus Homo, lived in the jungle where there was a lot of fruit. It was accustomed to consuming fructose at all times and in very large quantities. Then came the glaciations and the human being. The Homo had to survive in the African savanna with nothing to eat and could only practically eat carrion when we started eating meat and when the brain and fats developed. And they lived on the coast. and could eat a lot of fish, so they consumed a lot of omega-3. But what happens, since they ate when they could and when they hunted, they consumed large amounts of food and had to generate reserves from that. And in order to be able to eat such large amounts of food and for the body to generate reserves and metabolize it correctly, insulin resistance was developed, and they also went through long periods of fasting. So at one point in history, that helped us survive. But nowadays, with food available at all times and the consumption of a lot of sugars and fructose, we have developed insulin resistance, which is one of the causes of metabolic syndrome and obesity. This is where that genetic burden comes from. Well, as we can see, the act of eating is tremendously complex. Other things I recommend you read are a bit of anthropology to understand all the socio-cultural factors that influence. There is a very interesting book by Contreras, and I often quote this phrase because I like it and because it defines very well the complexity of the act of eating, which is a biological, nutritional, medical, but also social, psychological, economic, symbolic, religious, and emotional act. All of this must be taken into account. And another phrase from Fitzler that is also in Contreras' book, which is interesting, talks about how we are omnivores, and that is good on one hand because we have the freedom of choice. We can eat many more things than someone who is an herbivore, vegetarian, or carnivore. However, we are conditioned because we need much more diversity. We need variety for our nutrition to be optimal, and that makes everything much more complex. In the book, in the video I mentioned for you to watch by Campillo, he talks about the food funnel we are caught in. If we think about how many foods we eat in a day or in a week, really few people will say more than 50. If we arrive at this point, we are eating very, very, very basic diets. When one starts to follow a more anti-inflammatory diet, for example, when we remove wheat, we suddenly discover that there is quinoa, that there is millet, that there is buckwheat, that there is oats, and that there are a lot of cereals that we didn't know about and don't eat. It is good for us to rotate more, to open up that range so that nutrition is optimal, because in the end we are poorly nourished as we are eating very few things, and yet an excess of calories, which refers to the double burden of malnutrition that was also mentioned yesterday. We are overfed but poorly nourished, which is what the World Health Organization calls the double burden of nutrition. We are malnourished in two ways, both by excess and by deficiency. We eat a lot, but there is a funnel. We are eating very few foods. Our diet is not complex at all. And what does the selection of foods depend on? Well, on many things. And another thing to keep in mind is that nowadays we are increasingly treating people from more countries, not just those who follow a Mediterranean diet and are familiar with it. I have patients from Central America, South America, and Asian patients for whom not everything nutritious or non-toxic is considered food in different societies. Well, this is simply something that I find curious to mention so that we can continue to understand the complexity a bit more. For example, we do not consider insects as food, even though we know that they are not normally regarded as food. And what can I say about dogs? Even though we know they are very nutritious and provide exceptional nutrients, we often do not consider them food. And all of this is also important so that we adapt to what we understand, to what fits into our comprehension of our way of eating. The choice of foods depends on our accessibility to them, the availability of foods, cultural norms, socioeconomic factors, health status, and personal likes and dislikes. This is what theory states and what we all know. But nowadays, there is also a great media influence, which is why we no longer know what to eat. Years ago, or in the post-war period, there weren't many foods to eat. I can't talk to my grandmother. I just tell her who I am, and, well, she understands it and loves it. But the whole idea of dieting or having to understand what I need to eat is just so strange. But if food is just to be nourished and to satisfy the needs we have to cover, and little more. But of course, nowadays, there is such a large quantity of food. 80% of the food in the supermarket is completely processed, full of additives, and manufactured. Today, we really need to know something about labeling. As yesterday, they talked about what these foods are providing us. What is beyond just meat, fish, and vegetables, because we have much more. Moreover, there is a lot of information that sometimes confuses us. We have always talked about low-calorie diets. I eat well because I am on a diet to lose weight. And then you ask the person what they eat, everything is light, everything is zero. Everything But where are the nutrients here? Yes, the calories are very few and you are not eating animal fats, nor are you consuming refined sugars, but is what you are eating really nourishing you? And it is because nowadays we are conditioned by many things. We prioritize speed and simplicity. In order for the patient to follow their diet, I have to give them super simple options because we lead a crazy lifestyle. So I can't tell them to make a stew like I do, studying macrobiotics, which you have to cook for hours. Well, I can't tell them that because some people can while others can't. So I have to teach them how to cook in a quick and simple way, making very easy dinners so that it is effective. That's why in the end we rely a lot on fast food and eat at odd hours. We will also talk about chronobiology later. Anthropologists say that nowadays there is an individualization of the food system, a decentralization. Before we used to have dinner and everything together, and now we have lunch and breakfast, and now we have a lot of snacks. We are not eating in an organized way, and that also leads us to eat poorly. We are not making balanced meals like you all did here yesterday. Disconnection, as people no longer eat as a family. Everyone eats when they want. The act of eating together as a family is also beneficial because it helps us eat better. And although one risk factor for diseases is eating alone, that is living alone, because if we live alone or are alone, we ultimately do not worry as much about preparing food well, which is also important. Desynchronization, dinner as each one at their own time. One arrives at 11, another at 9. We need to be more aware of the importance of schedules and the dislocation. We don't eat while sitting. If we don't eat sitting at a table, we don't chew as well. Yesterday we talked about chewing, and I was going to comment on it a bit since it was discussed very well yesterday, so that's great. But it is important that we chew well, and for that we need to be seated properly and eat at a table as has been done all our lives. So what is integrative dietetics? It is understanding all of this. Of course, the science of nutrition. We need to know what our body needs, what an inflammatory diet is, what our needs are. But we also need to deeply understand the relationship between the body and the mind, the emotional bond we have with food. And for that, coaching, which we will discuss later, is very interesting. To understand this relationship, as it will help us take control of our nutrition and practice mindful eating. Now the term mindful eating has become fashionable. Mindfulness in food as eating in a conscious way, knowing what I am doing, savoring it, enjoying it, all of that is important.